So, as Michal explained, I joined the university actually just over a year ago, and I came here to develop the Institute for Community Research and Development and to lead that. Over the past just over a year, we've developed 3 core strands of work. So one of those is around criminal justice. Another strand of work is around preventing violence against women and girls. And our third strand of work we broadly term social inequalities, so research that looks at things around poverty, around housing and homelessness, those kinds of issues. And I'm really proud with where we've got to at this point, that the research that we're doing is already having an impact on the lives of people here within the region and further afield than that. But despite how proud I am of all of that work, I'm not going to talk generally about what the Institute is doing. I'm going to focus on quite a narrow stream of my own research. So as a psychologist, I'm interested in people and why people end up in the situations that they end up in. For me, that is particularly when people end up in bad situations, negative situations, and thinking about how can we try and prevent that happening, but also how can we try and prevent that happening again when someone is in a difficult or a bad situation. So some of my work leading on from that is with women involved in the criminal justice system. Some of my work is around how we assess people's needs and risks once they have become involved in the justice system. And then the other part of my work looks at the role of the arts in criminal justice, or as I've termed it in the title of tonight's lecture, creative approaches to rehabilitation in the criminal justice system. So what I'm going to cover, I know there are people in the room who don't have experience or haven't worked in the criminal justice system, so I want to just give you a little bit of context just to situate things. I'm then hoping to take you on a bit of a journey through some of my research in this area, what some of the research says generally, and give you a bit of a flavour, a taste of the arts, and what that looks like and what that does. And then finally, just a little bit of a look at what's next, is some of the work that we've got coming up and some of the ways in which this work might be developing. So the context bit. I'm talking about England and Wales because the criminal justice systems in Scotland and Northern Ireland run separately and slightly differently, and most of my own work takes place here in England and Wales. So I'll talk you through that. HM Prison Probation Service, it sits underneath the Ministry of Justice, and the thing I'm going to talk briefly about is the practical element of that. So we have HM Prison Service, which I'll come on to in a minute. We have the National Probation Service, and we have more recently community rehabilitation companies. The National Probation Service deals with all of the risk assessment. So every person who comes into contact, every adult who comes into contact with the justice system has a risk assessment done on or with them. So the probation service takes responsibility for that, which then informs what happens to those people next. And those people who are judged to be high risk are managed through the probation service. Anyone who is now judged to be low or medium risk is managed through all of these community rehabilitation companies. So that applies to adults. If we're talking about young people aged 10 to 17, they're managed through a slightly separate system. They will go through youth courts. If they're given a custodial sentence, they'll be sent to some form of secure unit generally, and they will be dealt with by youth offending teams. And the main aim of youth offending teams is to try and help steer young people away from involvement in crime. The image here, I need to say thanks to an organisation called Clinks for the image that's on the screen behind you. I know that you can't read the names of the prisons, but what this gives you is an indication of the geographic dispersal of the 123 or so prisons that exist in England and Wales at the current time. Those that are highlighted in purple, there should be 10 of them, I think, and they're women's prisons, and you'll notice how very geographically dispersed they are. We have, at last count, 8 secure or Category A prisons, a number of young offender institutions for young people aged between 18 and 21, and then the rest of the prison establishments are split up between categories B, C and D, with category D being what we either resettlement or open prisons, so helping to get people ready for being back in the community, preparing people for that. So that's roughly what that looks like. And these are just some images of prisons that I've done work in over the years. I've worked in adult male prisons with adult women, with young people, but also with people post-release when they're going back into the community. And the thing that I want to say today, and I want you to think about, is that prisons contain the whole spectrum of life. So it is simply not possible to talk about prisons just containing criminals and to lump everybody together. We are talking about such a variety of people. We're talking about some people who have done some very bad things, but we're also talking about people who, some of whom are very vulnerable, some of whom have had very bad things happen to them, and some people who are very unwell. So we have a real mix and variety. So I promised myself that I wasn't going to use today's lecture to have a rant or a vent about the state of the criminal justice system, particularly the state of our prisons. So I'm not. I am going to try and avoid that, but if any of it slips in, I apologise in advance. The fundamental premise upon which the criminal justice system should be based, and this is not just in my opinion, although this does underpin all of my work, but it's what the evidence tells us, is that punishment in and of itself is ineffective. Punishment alone will only result in increasing people's risk of reoffending again in the future. So HM Prison Service states that we keep those sentenced to prison in custody, helping them lead law-abiding and useful lives, both while they are in prison and after they are released. It's quite interesting for me in that when I used to talk about the purpose of the criminal justice system, the Prison Service website said all sorts of lovely things about how we treat people humanely, but that has all disappeared off the website. But this bit in the middle of that quote off the Prison Service website, helping people lead law-abiding and useful lives. So that bit is really where we should be talking about rehabilitation rather than just punishment. So if we rehabilitate people, it's that will help reduce risk of reoffending. So if we give people the skills and the desire to rehabilitate and to live more positive lives, that is good. It's not just good for those individuals who found themselves in contact with the criminal justice system, but it's good for the whole of society, and it's also good in economic terms because prisons and the justice system is incredibly expensive, so this is good for everybody. So with that context in mind, in 2001 I was offered my first research assistant post. And that post, the point of that post was to take my skills and my learning in psychology and research methods and apply it to measuring the success of these rehabilitation programs. So did traditional rehabilitation programs in prison or in the community, were they effective in reducing average reoffending rates? And while that was really interesting work, what became apparent to me while I was doing that sort of analysis, that type of measurement, was that there were just some people who were not able, not ready, didn't have the skills to engage in those rehabilitation programs. So let me give you an example. If some of the traditional rehabilitation programs that we talk about in prisons in particular might be a thinking skills programme which aims to help people think through the consequences of their actions. Or we might see a formal education programme where people go in and they're in a classroom environment aiming maybe towards some basic skills qualifications. But if we think about a large proportion of people in our prisons who left school at an early age, were completely disengaged from education, many of them have never really felt like they've achieved anything before, to take some of that group of people and put them in that formal offending behaviour programme education setting is just too much of a leap for people to engage with. So this seems to be a problem for some people. So if I fast forward to 2007, I was approached by an organisation called Good Vibrations, a charitable organisation who were working at that time pretty much predominantly in prisons, running week-long music programmes, and they were running those music programmes using a form of Indonesian gamelan music, which, now that I know a lot about this, doesn't quite sound as odd to me as it did when I first heard about this. I didn't know how to pronounce the name, gamelan. And I've always been very honest and said I was really sceptical of this. I'd been asked to take the skills that I was using to measure the effectiveness of these offending behaviour rehabilitation programmes and apply that to a music programme, and it just didn't really know how that was going to go. I was pretty sceptical about it. Rather than me talk to you anymore about Good Vibrations though, I'm going to show you a short video clip. It's about 1.5 minutes long. It tells you a bit about the organisation, but it also will allow you to hear some of the music that's being produced in prisons and give you a bit of an insight into the work that they do. To work with the facilitators, with the prisoners who were taking part in these programmes, and I went into a number of prisons and looked at the programme operating over the week, and then also at the end of the week this culminated in a performance. So the prisoners, maybe a group of 12 of them, would perform the music that they had written throughout the week to a group of other prisoners, to prison officers, and often to external audiences coming in to that environment. It might have been their friends, it might have been their family, other invited people. And there were quite a few things came out of that particular piece of research, but some of the really interesting stuff was that people who took part in that programme, we saw an increase in their social and communication skills. And quite a few times people have said to me, well why is that important? Why do we care about the social and communication skills of people in prison? And I guess the answer to that is that if sometimes we're talking about groups of people who may not be good at talking things through with one another, who may sometimes resort to arguing, to aggression, rather than being able to talk through an issue, seeing that a programme like this helps people function as a group, improves those skills, is a really important thing. It's a very important skill to develop. Other things that came out of that were the participants talked a lot about the calming nature of the experience, the calming nature of the music, and I think you can hear that a little bit when you listen to the music. But aside from the health and well-being benefits of that sort of experience, again, we saw that those reports then translated into a reduction in aggressive and violent incidents. So again, we see that impact happening. And what was very interesting for me is that for many of the people who took part in these programmes, it seemed to act as what we called a stepping stone into further education, into more formal programmes. So people were given the confidence, could see that they could achieve something, and if you've never achieved anything before, that performance on that Friday is a really big deal. And so it helped prompt people, prepare them to take part in other programmes. And so over the past decade, myself and in fact a number of people in this room, practitioners, organisations, researchers have spent a long time trying to shift the narrative around some of this so that we're not talking about, say, a music programme like Good Vibrations and its impact directly on reoffending. But what we're talking about is what we call mediating factors. So if a programme helps improve someone's social skills that then reduces their violent incidents, if it gets them involved in formal rehabilitation and education, so we go from this programme into those things that we know are statistically predictive of reductions in risk of reoffending. So this mediating factors. So there's been a lot of work over the last decade or so in shifting that narrative. So the images that you see behind me are from a number of arts and creative projects that I've worked with, and I will talk through some of those as we move on. But just to give you a bit of a flavour, most of the arts and creative programmes that we see in the criminal justice system are run by voluntary sector organisations, so there's quite a limited amount of kind of statutory work, which means that every different prison that you go to, every community setting that you engage with, you see very different things happening. So there's a wide range of stuff going on. And it might be music, it might be drama, it might be art, it might be dance. We see a really wide variety of work that happens. So to talk you through one of these particular initiatives, programmes, a little while after I'd been involved with Good Vibrations, I got asked to get involved in a discussion around the development of an artist in residence initiative at a prison called HMP Grendon. If you haven't heard of HMP Grendon, it's a therapeutic community prison, and that is, it's a prison that functions in quite a different way to the rest of the prison estate. Although there are some prisons that have therapeutic community wings, but essentially HMP Grendon has not quite the same hierarchy as other prisons. Prisoners and staff refer to each other by their first names, which is quite unusual. Each wing in the prison operates as its own community, so decisions about what happens on that wing are taken by the community in their weekly group meetings. So this is very different to what we would usually see in a prison. And so the conversations around bringing in an artist in residence were situated around that this was to be an inspirational role. So bringing in an artist as an artist, not an artist as a teacher or as a therapist, but as an artist with that focus to inspire people, to bring people on. And the images that you see on screen, in your right, top right, is Lorna, who was the first artist in residence. We then have, on the bottom right, one of the a painting that happened in the first residency by a prisoner who had a military history. In the middle, these bird cages, the men in the prison decided to embark on a project where they made 235 bird cages from straws, and 235 represents every single individual who was residing in that prison at that time. And many of the exhibits from the residency were taken to the Guardian offices in London at a very high-profile exhibition that was lucky enough to go and see. A lot of footfall, really high-profile, very, very interesting exhibition. As an aside, I saw today that the Icon Gallery in Birmingham, who now manages this residency, they're advertising for a new artist to come in and take up the residency for a 3-year period. So if you know any artists that might be interested in that job, I imagine it would be challenging and fascinating and really worthwhile. So what I was interested in with this programme as a researcher was the impact on participants, but not just that. I had this idea that there might also be an impact on the prison more broadly of having something like this kind of initiative in there, but nothing like this had really been done in quite this way. So we were playing around with things a little bit. So I went in and worked with the prisoners, did interviews and observations of what was happening in those sessions, so a piece of in-depth qualitative work, but also did some quantitative measures of what we call social climate. So these are measures that give us an indication of how safe people feel in any particular environment, how much social cohesion there is in that environment, and you can measure that change over time. So bringing together both of those methods. And this was being in there and doing this work was one of those moments in your life where you just kind of stop and think, how on earth did I get here? I was sitting in a wing of the prison in one of the communities, and with a group of men who I knew some of them had committed some very serious offences, and I'm sitting across the table from a man doing a pencil drawing of him and just thinking, this is not where I imagined my life was going to take me, but interesting nonetheless. So the things that came out of that, the findings did support some of the previous work that we'd been doing. So improvements in people's social skills, their ability to work in a group, we found those sorts of things. We found that those people taking part had started to redefine themselves. So to think about themselves as people who maybe had some artistic ability, who could achieve in these sorts of ways. And that is different to the way that many prisoners see themselves as prisoners, as offenders, so starting to see themselves in a different way. But what we also saw was that there was a quantitative improvement in the prison environment, in people's perceptions of safety, cohesion, social climate. And what came out as being particularly relevant, we think, to the success of this programme was the status of the artist. Someone that the prisoners felt like any feedback from them, critical feedback from the artist, they really valued, they really respected in a different way than they might have felt if this was a teacher or a therapist. So just want to take stock for a minute and give you a very quick overview of, up until this point, what the research in this area told us. So a number of studies tell us that the arts is a good way to open people up to different types of educational courses. That the arts can be useful in a criminal justice setting to help people redefine themselves. And criminologists will tell us that this is closely related to what we call desistance. So that for someone to desist from crime, so to stop committing crimes, it's not just about the physical act of not committing any more crimes, but that what is really important to that is seeing yourself as someone who doesn't commit crimes, so that the arts can help people see themselves in a different way. Increases in confidence and social skills. Positive regulation of emotions, so having an outlet for negative emotions, for aggressive emotions. Increased well-being, and also that the arts provide safe spaces. So if you've ever spent time in a prison, worked in a prison, you will know that safe spaces are in short supply. If you work with young people who find themselves in contact with the criminal justice system, you know that often those young people don't have many safe spaces in their lives. So this has come out in the research generally. But as any good researcher will tell you, with research comes criticisms of that research. So Nina Burrows and colleagues, back in 2013, noted that there were some problems with the research in this area, and I feel like I should point out that this wasn't just a criticism of my work, other people's too. And what Burrows and colleagues said was that there was too much focus in this evidence base on prisoner and practitioner views, that the sample sizes were too small in the studies that existed, that there was a lack of control group data. So there, what Burrows and colleagues are saying is that if we're only looking at a music programme, for instance, and don't have a control group, how can we say that what is happening is due to that music programme and not something else that was going on? And I'll come back to that point a bit later. And then there was a lack of pre- and post-test data, so measuring change over time. But if we just ask people to reflect, maybe that's not very robust. Now, I don't necessarily agree with all of the criticisms that Burrows and colleagues set out there, but I did take them seriously. The bit that I guess I particularly disagree with is the focus on prisoner and practitioner views, because for me, in everything we do, we should be foregrounding the experience and the voice of those people taking part, so that we understand not if there is an impact, but how that impact happens. So we need both of those things. So in the same year, Charlotte Bilby and I published a report called Reimagining Futures through the Arts Alliance. We noted that there was a clear need for longitudinal research, so over a longer time period, that combined both those qualitative and quantitative methods. So partly in response to that, between 2014 and 2018, I've been working with the Youth Offending Service to have a look at a music programme that they run with young people in contact with their service. The images on screen are of the studio that this work takes place in, and it's a professional studio, and the young people get to go along roughly for about 12 weeks, usually as part of their sentence, and they engage in things like developing their music production skills, their singing, their lyric writing, and any of the other work that they might want to do around that. And for the team working on that programme, for the Youth Offending Service, the aim of this programme is to improve the creative and expressive musical ability of the young people, but also to improve levels of sentence compliance. So how well are young people engaging in their sentence? How often, how regularly are they turning up to the appointments that they need to be at? So I'm going to try really hard not to get really geeky about the next bit, but for those people who know me, they know that I get really excited about data and about research methods. But what we've been doing over the past 4 years or so is working with the young people, the girls and boys who've been taking part in this programme, but we've also been getting data from the Youth Offending Service, the data that they routinely collect to draw all of this together. And so we have been able to have a control group. So we've got a group of young people who've been taking part in the music programme, and we've got a group of young people who haven't been taking part in the music programme, and we've matched those two groups on key factors, key variables, so things like age, things like gender, things like length of sentence. And so what that should be able to tell us when we look at the compliance data is whether if the only thing that those two groups differ on is whether or not they've taken part in a music programme, if we see a difference, we'll know that that is due to the music programme. We have included pre- and post-test measures. So at the beginning of the programme, we measured things like well-being, like attitudes and behaviours, and then measured that again towards the end, so we can see if there's any change over time. So this was all responding to some of those criticisms labelled at this type of work. But then the qualitative bit, the voice and experience of the young people, and again, if the top two things tell us if a programme is having an impact, the bottom part there, the participant voice, can help us gain some insight into how that might be happening. So the next bit's the really exciting bit for me, but I mean, I don't know whether everyone else will agree. We found that young people who completed the music programme were statistically more likely to comply with their sentence than the control group who hadn't taken part in the music programme. And I guess from the Youth Offending Service perspective, this is really good news. Young people are engaging better with their sentence, and engagement with your sentence is more likely to result in better outcomes. So this is really good news. There were significant improvements in participants' reported well-being and musical ability. We also saw some improvements in attitudes and behaviours, but just not quite at a level that reached statistical significance. But it was still positive. So the data that we've had and the amount of data that we've got suggests that these things are quite generalisable, so they're not just about that group, that we can generalise these things slightly more broadly than that. The picture that's up there, I noticed Mihal mentioned my most recent book, so this is my plug for the book, just to say, if anyone is interested in hearing a little bit more about these types of methods and what we do there, that's a really good book to have a look at. So that's the quantitative bit, the bit that tells us that something happened. Qualitatively, the young people were incredibly, overwhelmingly positive about their experience in the programme. They talked to us about their increases in confidence, their improved social skills, their well-being, how they were able to manage their emotions in a better, more positive way. Several of them had gone on to re-engage with education, and like the artist in residence work that we had completed, what came out as being absolutely crucial to the success of this programme was the status of the music leaders and indeed of the studio as being professional spaces where the young people were given feedback that was often critical, but constructively critical, but they really valued it because it was coming from someone who knew what they were doing and had those professional skills. We're just about to publish this work. In fact, I need to finish my draft of that paper. So it will be published soon, but it was also made reference to, last year the government produced a report called Creative Health, and this work was made reference to within that report. There are various other pieces of research in this area that I've been involved with, but I want to just move us bang up to date now and have a little look at what we're doing currently and what we're about to do. So, for me, the conversation has moved on, really, from not whether or if the arts have an impact, but how is that impact happening, and also how can we use the skills that as practitioners, as researchers, we've developed to try and to do even better. So a few weeks ago, we launched a report that had looked at a programme called Making for Change. Making for Change is a fashion training and manufacturing unit which was set up in a women's prison in the south of England by London College of Fashion in collaboration with the prison service. And the programme gives women training in educational qualifications and training in fashion skills and manufacturing, as well as helping develop some of those creative skills at the same time. The other thing that's particularly interesting about this programme is they're not just thinking about those women in that prison taking part in the programme, but having identified that there's a skill shortage in that area in fashion manufacturing, that this could help fill. So there's all sorts of interesting things going on there. So I'm really conscious in everything that I've been talking about today, and that a limitation of my work is that I foreground the individual, the psychological, the criminological aspects, and the arts, the creative work is almost in the background of it. So for this piece of work, for this research, we brought together a psychologist, a criminologist, and an academic colleague who has a background working in fashion and design, to have a look at what the impact was, but also to think about the products, the education, the processes that were happening in this project, so that we could also try and make helpful recommendations about the development of the programme. So, as you might expect by now from all of the things that we've been saying, or that I've been saying, we saw increases in the well-being of the women taking part. Now, for women in prison, that's particularly important because, as a whole, the mental health and well-being of women in prison is extremely problematic. So, a programme that has a positive impact there is a really good thing. We were able to give feedback on the products, the education, the processes, which is stuff that I don't know anything about, so I learned a lot through this programme and through doing this research. But really interestingly, we found that there had been, that the women had been inspired and felt like their aspirations had been improved. So what was quite unusual in some ways for me in this programme is that the majority of the women that Making for Change is working with were talking about wanting to go into this industry as a line of work, and I don't always see that with the programmes that I work with, but they're not always aiming to do that. And so their aspirations have been raised to think, I can do this, this could be a potential career for me. But the feedback, let's close that, the recommendations, the discussions we were able to take to the Making for Change team, are that if you raise people's aspirations, you also... That was always going to be a bit dangerous, wasn't it? If you raise people's aspirations, you also have to provide the opportunity for those aspirations to be realised. And so when Making for Change started out, this was part of the aim, but the model that we were able to develop with the London College of Fashion Making for Change team was really to think about ensuring that those opportunities were real and there for the women. Excuse me. So we end up with this model where Making for Change delivers training, it delivers work experience through the unit, and then work experience when people are released on temporary licence, so going out into the community, and then employment opportunities upon release. So for me as a researcher, as an evaluator, to be able to see that the recommendations we had made were immediately taken on board and acted upon is a nice way for me to see impact of the work that we're doing. So what next? I and a couple of colleagues who are sitting in this room, we're working currently with the Irene Taylor Trust, who run programmes called Music in Prisons, and they've been doing this for quite a long time, but more recently they've been running a programme called Sounding Out, which works with people on release from prison. So we're in the middle of that work, hoping to publish that report probably around January time. And also doing some really exciting work with Central St Martin's, what we're calling Safe for Sale Furniture at the minute, but I think that name might change, funded by the Ministry of Justice. And this work will be in prisons, a process of co-design with prisoners, with prison staff, with designers, looking at how we make the furniture in those settings more robust. But really, I guess the bit that is more interesting for me is that my work is sometimes, I feel, is a little bit limited by the funding that I have. So if I'm doing some research or an evaluation for a charitable organisation and they have funders, they need to answer the questions that their funders have. So that puts some of my work within boxes, restricts it a little bit. So for me, it's the work that my PhD students are doing which really pushes this on, because they don't have those same funding restrictions around their work. So Ella Simpson, one of my students, is working with creative practitioners who work in prisons, not to look at the impact on the prisoners, but to understand who these creative writers are. What is it about them and what they take into these settings that might be interesting or valuable? What can we learn from that? More recently, Helen Rogers joined me as a PhD student, and we hope that she'll be going out to work with Geese Theatre. If you haven't come across Geese Theatre's work, I highly recommend that you have a look at it. They're doing some very inspirational stuff. And what we hope Helen will do is go out and have a look at the actor training process that Geese that their actors go through, and see what we can ascertain, what we can learn from that. So it's really starting to push the boundaries in a way that I guess my own work hasn't got to. If you want to know more about any of this work, highly recommend having a look at the National Criminal Justice Arts Alliance. They're an umbrella organisation who advocate for work in this area. They run lots of interesting events, they publish, and they have been so supportive of my work. They also developed something called the Evidence Library, which is an online repository of research and studies in this area. I think there are probably 100 or so studies accessible through that, including some of my work. And as I mentioned earlier, last year there was a report published called Creative Health, which came out of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Arts, Health and Wellbeing, which touches a little bit on this area, although is more broadly about the role of the arts on health and well-being. So we've come a long way, I've come a long way in my understanding of this area, and the message that I really want to leave you with is not that the arts are a cure-all or a fix-all, because they're not, but the arts are really important in the criminal justice system. There is some really good work, some work that is having an impact going on, and so for me this is about how we continue to develop that, how we use the expertise that we've got to refine it and to continue to move things on. Thank you very much.